Obviously, Scott, who was instrumental in developing the matrix of alternatives and was a integral consultant on the development of the 208 wastewater plan. We're just blessed to be able to have that kind of expertise now assisting the town going through this process to try to develop a wastewater plan. Our goal is obviously to get a watershed permit as quickly as we can. That opens up funding opportunities, and it opens up a lot of other opportunities for the town that otherwise wouldn't be available. And as people start to walk through that door, those opportunities are going to become less and less. So I think that's the other thing that we need to be thinking about. The other thing is that it gets, obviously we've got a crisis right now in the harbor. I think most people are looking at the Black Mayo problem and our water quality problems as a growing crisis, not just it's a problem and getting worse. But we're clearly seeing, and Conservation Commission and other folks can speak more directly to that. Our water quality data is showing a precipitous decline in water quality in the harbor. So we also have the obligation that I think everybody shares to get something going as quickly as possible that's going to provide the greatest amount of benefits in the shortest period of time. And that's where alternatives are very, very attractive, because we do see in watershed improvements much more quickly than if we built a sewer system that maybe 20 to 30 or 40 years from now we'd start to see those residual benefits from having intercepted water streams that are then reaching the harbor. So a hard pipe infrastructure program is going to yield us the longest lag in results, as well as probably the highest cost. So with that, I will turn it over to Scott to kind of present some of the thinking that we're working through relative to the elements that could be part of a watershed permit. And really looking, again, this is a conversation. This isn't a presentation. It's a starting point, not an end point. And we'll be very interested to hear not only from staff, but obviously other boards and committees.
Okay, thanks, Kurt. And I was asked to stay sitting during my presentation for filming purposes, so I'll do that if that will work best. And Kurt stole a lot of my introductory remarks and did a better job than I would have done, so I won't review sort of why we're here. But I'm very interested and excited working with the town to try to come up with a so-called targeted watershed plan, which is what the state of Massachusetts ultimately requires to then get you, as Kurt mentioned, a watershed permit, which is really the step towards resolving some of these issues with water quality and coastal waters. So the slides I'm going to show you really is sort of the third rendition of I've been working with the Wastewater Committee. A few of you have been at those meetings, so a little bit of repeat, although there are 4 or 5 new slides nobody's seen today. So it's an updated version, and I provided these slides to the Wastewater Committee and Hillary and others who are all available. I'm happy to answer questions along the way if you have something specific to the slide, but perhaps we could wait for general questions towards the end. Did you mention that, or thoughts?
I mean, I generally think if you have questions during a slide, it's probably better as long as
clarification.
if you're
fine.
getting
I'm fine.
off track.
Yeah.
So what's the yellow line?
Okay, so well, actually, I'll speak to it at this slide. And I should mention, every time I do a slideshow, I also teach adjunct up at Harvard and Tufts, and I have to disclose that I'm partially colorblind. So when you ask me a question like that, John, I can make sure I'm looking at the right lines. But let me use this slide, because I guess you were going to ask about the subwatersheds for clarification, right? So this slide does come from the MEP, and I'll mention that I'm assuming most people are familiar with that acronym. It's the Massachusetts Estuaries Project that has done a series of reports, including Wellfleet, on assessing nitrogen impacts on coastal embayments. And this map comes from that report, and these show what are called subwatersheds. The overall watershed, which kind of goes off to the map to the north up in Truro, is the Wellfleet Harbor estuary system. But what MEP has done is broken it down into subcomponents. So there are sub-embayments. In fact, maybe what I'll do is I'll label the slide the next time so we see all the sub-embayments. And each sub-embayment, for example, Herring River is one of them up here to the north. That northeast, that has its own sub-watershed. So there's sub-embayments and sub-watersheds. I'm going to show you a slide in a couple minutes that shows that in tabular form. And to meet the goals sort of numerically, the town needs to resolve the overall nitrogen loading to the Wellfleet Harbor system, but they also need to meet individual targets for each sub-embayment, which is one of the trickier parts of this report. John?
Is this all based on the water table map? So
The which map?
The water table map, so is this the contributing area?
Yes, good, thank you. So these sub-embayments, it's interesting, it's very unique. As you go around the country doing this kind of work, most people use surface watersheds, meaning the way the water drains over the surface of the land to get into their coastal waters or streams. Here on Cape Cod, and thanks to a lot of the good work by the U.S. Geological Survey as well as some of the Park Service work out in this part of the Cape, we have a great understanding of the hydrology, and on Cape Cod it's highly controlled by groundwater and not surface flow. So these lines, by the way, John knows the answers to all these questions he's asking. He's just they're good. These lines are based upon groundwater water table contours, which is the right way to do it for Cape Cod. So if we're thinking about nitrogen sources such as septic systems and lawn fertilizers, then these lines will be a pointer, yeah. These will be a good way to delineate those sub-watersheds. So another way of saying that is each one of these little sub-components, and I guess I can point you here, which one is it?
Top button.
This one. So for example, right here, that groundwater flows into this surface water. Whoops, it goes away on me. There's a real direct relationship between each sub-watershed and each sub-embayment. And again, I'll show you that in this slide right here. So many of these slides are directly from the MEP report. I've tried to label many of them, but this one I didn't, but it is. So on the left we can see the so-called sub-embayments, and then it says system total at the bottom. That means the whole Wellfleet Harbor system. So each one of these, 7 primary sub-embayments are the way they are broken out in the MEP report. And just quickly going from left to right, what we're seeing here is nitrogen loads, and these are in kilograms per day, and that's important because the MEP report and my slides are going to go back and forth between kilograms per day and kilograms per year, so we need to be careful of what we're looking at here. This one's in kilograms per day. And so you can see each of the sub-embayments, Herring River, Duck Creek, the Cove, etc., have a so-called present load. Now I should mention that this report was published in 2017, but a lot of the analyses were done in the early 2000s. So in a little bit of a sense, some of these numbers are a little bit dated, and we'll get to that in a minute. The present load probably means somewhere between 2004 and 2010 what was occurring. And then as we move to the right, there's a column that says target threshold. According to the MEP model, those are the loads that we need to get to resolve the water quality problems. Okay, so there's kind of existing and present. You can see in virtually all cases, the present loads are higher than the threshold, which is why we have water quality problems. And as Kurt mentioned, some of the most current data is suggesting that may be actually getting even worse since this report was done. As you go further to the right, what this starts to do is break out some of the components. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time now because I'll come back to this, but it is worth mentioning a lot of nitrogen actually falls out of the sky as direct precipitation. Here in the northeast U.S. we have very high nitrogen levels in our precipitation, largely due to upstream, and I mean upwind sources like the mid-U.S. Ohio Valley emissions from power plants is a big source. And also where the air comes from seems to be a variable. There's a recent study done by Ivan Valiella down at Woods Hole that shows that nitrogen levels are going down in precipitation significantly because of Clean Air Act and also some changes in airflow patterns. We seem to be getting more air from Canada now than we used to. Some people think because of climate change effects. So things have changed a little bit, but the reason I just highlighted for a second is you'll notice on Wellfleet Harbor system itself, it's a huge source, 64 kilograms per day as direct precipitation. That's a big variable. Unfortunately, that's something that we can't control. So it's really not on the table for Wellfleet to do something about. So the types of strategies we're going to talk about later are other sources. We can also see that there's benthic sources, and this is fluxes of nitrogen coming out of the sediments, et cetera. And I'll just kind of skip over to the far right. These are the percent reductions needed to achieve the TMDL. So you can see that overall, if we just look at the system total, it's about 31% a reduction. And the town gets to decide how they want to achieve that. And we'll get to that. We've got some potential solutions.
And one other thing I just
Yep.
want to keep in mind, these targets are based on their current targets. And, you know, Scott will talk a little bit more about this later, but, you know, as we have growth in the town, you know, both in terms of new construction and whatnot, we will be needing to do more than what these current targets show. It's a little bit uncertain in terms of what that looks like, but at least what we're trying to do is establish the minimum baseline that we have to comply with in order to be, you know, in order to be in compliance with DEP requirements.
Okay. So here's a little bit more specific breakdown. It's a little maybe easier to read. And what MEP did here was they just took as the bolded terms up there, say, watershed loads. And attenuated by the way, means how much actually gets to the embayment, because there are some losses of nitrogen between sources and embayment. So this is how much ultimately gets there. And again, we're comparing present load, and again, this is, let's say, mid-2000s. Threshold is the target we need to get to, and then on the far right, those are the percent reductions for each of the sub-embayments or sub-embayments in this case. So you can see it ranges from as little as 2% for Herring River up to the highest one, I guess, is the Cove at 69%. Okay.
Scott, I have a
Yes,
question
go ahead,
about
John. Yep.
The cove, first of all, the highest fraction of loading in that first table you showed was from benthic flux.
Yes.
And the highest benthic flux was from the cove.
Right.
And the cove sampling stations are in the dredged basin in the cove. So I'm wondering, I have been wondering, I just want to bring that point up.
Yes.
Here.
The effect of dredging.
The effect of dredging, and also there's additional information recently from Agnes Mittermeier's work. She's only presented it. It's not been peer reviewed.
Yep.
But I think we need to pay attention to that, because she found that the nitrogen, looking at stable nitrogen isotopes, the nitrogen does not appear to be coming from septic waste. And she analyzed specifically the black mayonnaise in these deep basins.
Okay, I'd love to.
So I'll shut up now. I just want to.
No, please.
Well,
This is great, John.
It's also something that we've been concerned about that from the outset, and in fact, again, you know, looking at natural alternatives becomes that much more important when the largest component is not human in origin.
Apparently.
Yeah.
Scott, I have a question.
Please.
When was this data compiled?
Well, the report is in 2017, but depending on what we're looking at, somewhere between 2004 and 2017.
Yeah. So, by saying that this is the, you know, the mark that you're shooting for, we could be way off at this point, right?
Well, I think the thresholds, column 2 there, is probably not going to change in any time soon.
Drastically? Or,
Right.
Okay.
The numbers that we need to talk about, and I've got another slide coming up here, is what the current load is, or perhaps more importantly, what the future load might be under so-called build-out conditions that the town's going to want to target in their plan.
And let me answer that a slightly different way, because there's a lot of uncertainty about this information, not only what we've got now, but what it's going to be like in the future. And given so much uncertainty, I think the main thing that we need to focus on is coming up with a set of strategies that make sense from the very beginning to pursue. And part of the plan overall is this thing called adaptive management, which is you start out with what you think your best arrows in the your best quivers are, your best options are, and just start, do something, work on it. You know, begin with what you think makes the most sense, because at the end of the day, we're judged by what happens in the water body anyway.
Right,
So-
I understand that. I'm just worried that the state might hold us to a numbers game on this.
They will at
They
the
will.
outset,
They
and they
have to-
do, and that's how it
yeah.
starts out. So we start out with a numbers game process.
You have to use
You've
data.
got to do X amount, and that's where we are right now.
Okay.
going
numbers-
forward,
I would just say the numbers are tied to the estuaries report, not what's currently in the harbor today.
right, exactly. So it's really about just coming up with a strategy, getting going with something, and then adapting as time goes on.
But also having an ability to monitor that,
Correct.
you know, and with numbers. I mean, it can't be feelings, it's gotta be, this is what it shows number-wise, so you've gotta have a starting number in order to evaluate the next number,
Yep, and
and if it's working.
we have that, and we'll continue. The Provincetown Center for Coastal Studies does have a set of sampling stations. They are the official baseline, data gathering organization, and they will continue to do that. So that doesn't necessarily cost town of Wellfleet anything right now, but that monitoring has been going on and will continue to go on to show both our compliance or lack thereof and trends. And then within a given project, we may do additional monitoring, based on something that we want to get very fine-tuned data about.
I guess the only other comment, these are all great comments and questions. The only other comment I'd make about sort of the certainty of these numbers is, when we did worked on the 208 plan, there was a lot of time spent on exactly that before we got going, like how good are these numbers? And the simple answer, at least from my perspective, is they're about as good as you're going to find anywhere on the planet for this type of stuff. This model that MEP has developed has been peer-reviewed. It's not perfect, and Brian Howes, the principal author, will be the first one to admit that. There is no perfect model. So if we wait for that, we'll never get there. This model is pretty darn good. It's as good as they
And so long as it
get.
can evaluate the dredging pre and post, I mean,
Yes,
'cause
yes.
obviously that's gotta be a factor that's
Well, the other
very
thing I was
healthily
gonna,
driven.
yes, the other thing I was gonna say is there are factors here. I talked about the weather patterns and nitrogen. I mean, that's, who knows what's gonna happen with that in the future? What's the benefit of doing a dredging project? For nitrogen, we don't really know. I mean, I'll look at the study
Gotta be
that
prepared
John's
for that,
mentioning.
yeah.
But there's a lot of unknowns, and I'm gonna refer back to my prior client, Paul Nizwicki, the former director of the Cape Cod Commission. What he said during these discussions was, we need to be directionally correct. Meaning, we know we have a problem, we have a study, this is probably as good as it's gonna get, we know we need to go in that direction, let's go. And as Kurt was saying, when ultimately you get a permit with DEP, the nice thing about this new permitting strategy called watershed permitting is it creates a lot of flexibility.
It's adaptive.
It sets up a plan that the town starts working on, but then we start measuring water quality, and if it gets better faster than we think, everybody's happy. So there's some flexibility there in this adaptive management, and I'll talk about that when we get to the last slide. So let me keep going. Again, all good questions. So I think actually no, I didn't cover this. This is the percent reductions according to MEP report, again with so-called present loads. I've added a couple of slides that deal with this concept of build-out. Now, I assume that everybody knows what build-out is, but I'll just quickly say it's some prediction of future land uses in the town. There are an infinite number of ways to do a build-out depending on your assumptions. One good assumption is how many Chapter 40B affordable housing projects will there be in town? The answer is nobody has a clue. So there's a lot of unknowns going forward, but build-out studies take into account whatever the best assumptions you can. As part of the MEP report, there were 2 build-outs done, and I'm going to show you both of them. This one shows the so-called alternative build-out, and it shows that on the far right, what it does is it increases the so-called present loads by a range of percentages. You can see Hatches Creek is the one that goes up the most. Now, most of that watershed is in the town of Eastham. So that was per a lot of build-out analysis happening in that town, near the town line. But I'm going to show you another one. This is the other build-out analysis, which shows on the far left, watershed loads under the build-out. And again, watershed, by the way, refers to septic systems, lawn fertilizers, and stormwater runoff. Those are the 3 controllable land-based sources. Again, as comparison, we're showing in this, or MEP showing in this slide, what's coming from direct atmospheric fallout versus the benthic. So similar to the earlier slide. What I've done to try to help put these in perspective is put this slide together. And hopefully this is helpful. So what I've done is taken all 3 categories of nitrogen loads that are prepared as part of MEP, and that's the left column under kilograms per year. The so-called present load, which again, let's say call that 2004, 2006. The build-out, which I just showed you, and then the alternative build-out. The alternative build-out was something that I believe was requested by the town, when the MEP report was going on as another look at what might happen in the future. So there's a couple of options there. So you can see there's three numbers there, 55,000, 67,000, and almost 57,000. The target stays the same. That's the number that comes from the model and all the sampling results. That stays the same because that's based upon the hydrodynamics of the estuary system and measured concentrations. Yes?
Targeted build-out. Alternative build-out. What are those figures based on? Are they based on actual well fleet with a huge amount of national seashore and our various restrictions and the fact that, as a former housing authority member, build-out, I mean, what are these figures based on?
I can give you a quick answer. Maybe others know more detail than I do because I wasn't here when those were being done, and I think they were coordinated with the town planning department, I'm guessing.
So build-out is theoretical, if you took all of the buildable, quote, buildable parcels and built them out.
Are we built out?
No.
No.
So there were parcels
So-
that have restrictions, conservation restrictions, national park, et cetera. Those were assumed not to be buildable, although there is buildable land within the bounds of the park, which is interesting, privately held land there. I don't know if that's true in Wellfleet, but it is true in some other towns. But this is primarily lots that are either undeveloped or underdeveloped. So you own 20 acres, you have
That's
one
what I
house on it,
understand,
the minimum lot size is 1 acre, that's developable parcel, even though there's already a house on it.
Yeah,
An
because
alternative build-out is then based on something that, it was an attempt to base it on a little bit more realistic 20-year expectation for build-out.
Yeah, I find that estimates for build-out are usually not specific enough to an area.
Right.
And it's kind of generic.
Yeah, yes, yes.
So
Thank you.
so in this case, the alternative build-out, we tried to, Hillary and I spent a lot of time on this, to try to be
Thank you.
much more specific about areas that had the potential for more construction versus others, but then also look at it based on historic building trends in Wellfleet, rather than, the theoretical, well, here's all the parcels, so here's what ultimately could happen.
See, my point is historic building trends don't apply now. So, thank you, you answered my question.
So the take-home from this slide, or at least the intended take-home, is the far right column. This is the number that would be, once we agree to which target we're going to use, and that's a little bit of a question for Mass DEP. We'll be having a meeting with them. But one of those three numbers on the right will be the targeted reduction, as it says, meaning we got to put a plan together that shows we're going to remove that many kilograms per year. Okay, and it's going to be somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 kilograms per year. I suspect the answer is partly the choice of the town, along with DEP. That's where the answer will lie on what ultimately goes into the watershed permit. So that's something we should put on the agenda for our next meeting with DEP to get some clarification on what they're going to require, especially where you've got two different build-outs here. And part of that is going to be up to the town, I'm pretty sure, not just DEP. So I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time today, but just keep in mind those numbers, the 10,000, 20,000 kilograms per year as what we're trying to get to, okay? Now, this is a slide from the 208 plan, and I simply put it in here as a cue because when we did 208, and some of you were involved in this, there were a lot of public meetings out this way in Wellfleet, and Truro, and Eastham. And we looked at the broadest possible range of solutions possible. We started with what had been done in the Chesapeake Bay, which has been, more money has gone into the Chesapeake Bay than any other estuary in the world, I think, for nutrient management. So we started there, and then we expanded the list significantly. So there's a pretty good list of options. And there were a couple of technology panels reviewing all of these, whether or not they're applicable for Cape Cod. So all of these various approaches and technologies were looked at. Kurt mentioned earlier, the most common one obviously is building a wastewater treatment plant collection system. That has been done most commonly around the U.S. to deal with these problems. As part of the Cape Cod plan, we realized that many towns had already attempted that and not been successful, largely due to costs. So looking at alternatives made a lot of sense, and I still believe that's true here today in Wellfleet. It's well worth looking at some of the options. The way this was organized along the top, and I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. I'm going to focus on, I think, about 4 or 5 of these that I think are most applicable to Wellfleet. But just quickly, the way that they organized them with the Commission 208 plan is scale along the top, meaning things that could be done at the individual property out to neighborhood throughout the whole watershed and then maybe town-wide. So some of these alternatives have different scaling options. Then along the left, some of these things can be done at the source, like a septic system. Some of them can be done in the watershed, meaning between the septic system and the embayment, and we'll talk about some of those today that might have some application. And then the third option would be things that can be done in the water. And a good example of that might be shellfish or aquaculture. So a lot of different options considered here, and I should mention there was a plan prepared for Wellfleet Harbor as part of 208. That's really where I started. I started working with the town currently, and we've been modifying that based upon some very good discussions, some really good work done by people in the town. And that's what I think that's the intent where we're going to continue until we get to the plan finished, which I'm hoping to do 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, something like that. But depends on how many meetings we have, and I think meetings are good, so there's some variability there. But we want to boil this down from maybe 40 alternatives down to maybe 5 or 6, make the most sense for the town. Now let me start with, and we've had 2 meetings with Mass DEP, and I think I can say unequivocally that the plan that the town comes up with, the targeted plan, must or shall, you can pick your word, have a conventional wastewater collection and treatment option. There's no further discussion on that. It has to have, the plan has to have that in there. So we're working on that, and I'll let maybe Hillary want to jump in here a little bit, but I would consider this, I think there are less expensive and maybe better alternatives to get there than this. I'll say that right up front, I really believe that. But the plan has to have that in there because that's DEP knows that will work, and they want you to commit to that as a backup plan.
So we're required to have a contingency plan if we use the alternative. So the sewer design would be our contingency plan, and we currently have a request for proposals out to further evaluate the transfer station site for a collection and treatment center.
So this map shows a number of options. Thank you, Hillary. This shows a number of options that were highlighted by Environmental Partners report back in 2014. I should mention there were also at least 2 other studies that I reviewed that also did the similar type of thing, but I've just put their graphic in here. And it does show the transfer station up to the most northern yellow, I believe they're yellow, highlighted sites. And I've got another slide of that here. This is a map prepared by the Cape Cod Commission using LiDAR data for topography. And I don't know the date of the aerial, but it's relatively current. Off to the left portion there is the current landfill. And off to the right, this is about a 28-acre parcel over the town.
Yeah.
Off to the right is the current transfer station, and then up to the north of the transportation and to the east is some unutilized land within that parcel. So the thought is that that might be a place for the town to consider as an option, if they need to go there, for treatment and disposal. Now, the Cape Cod Commission, I should mention, they're not here today, I don't think.
No.
But they're a partner in this project, and they're offering and providing some significant assistance on this, which is one of the reasons I can do the work less expensively for the town. And I want to credit them here, not only with the map, but they've also done some calculations and analysis to suggest that if you needed to use only conventional sewering to solve all of these nitrogen problems, the largest plant that you need to build would be around 400,000 gallons per day flow. And that, there's some pretty specific criteria that DEP uses to show how big of a leaching field you would need for a treatment plant of that size. And the answer is, for this site, not for this site, but anywhere, for 400,000 gallons per day, that works out to about 150,000 square feet, which is a little more than 3 acres, okay? So that's kind of the spatial requirement you need for the leach field. Treatment plants are really, the treatment plant itself is relatively small. They're not that, it's not a big area requirement. You could probably almost say build one anywhere. I'm actually reviewing a project in the town of Weston where they're proposing to build the plant in the basement of the building, which I've never seen before. But that kind of illustrates you could really theoretically at least put these anywhere. The real siting issue is the leaching field. And you need area, let me just finish, you need depth of groundwater, and then you need to think about so-called sensitive receptors. So let me just comment on those and then we can, so the good news is aerially, and I have another map that, can I get up just for 1 second? Just to kind of give you an idea. A 3-acre parcel up in here is about, I'm gonna draw a rectangle, it's about that size. So there's room here for a 3-acre footprint. And the good news is, based upon the topography and some water table work the town has done quite a while ago, but I'm not sure the groundwater levels have changed much, it looks like there's plenty depth to groundwater too. I'm gonna guess and say 20 feet here. You need 5 feet. So from an aerial standpoint and a depth of water, this site looks pretty good. Now, it is in the Herring River watershed. And that's, according to the MEP studies, that's the one that is least vulnerable to nitrogen, or I should say least problematic with today's nitrogen. But nonetheless, if in fact the town needed to go there, that would be something that would need to be evaluated very carefully. Yes?
So, I don't like the idea that we have to spend money on this thing, which is contingency, but I understand completely. I'm a little disturbed, given my long history here, by the fact that this may happen. And the real sensitive issue is not finding this location to, appease the DEP. It's the, if it actually happened, the amount, lengths of pipe that it would take throughout the town to get there.
Right.
Therefore, my question for you is, how much more would it cost to have another site evaluated, in other words, to have 2 sites, so as to reduce the miles and miles of pipe? Because what could happen is this doesn't work. I hope it does work. I think the alternatives are going to work. But what if they don't? Or what if push comes to shove somehow, the DEP gets more kick-ass about it, and all of a sudden, we need to put it into, being. We need to make it happen, this alternative. And this plan has not included another site for, the part of Wellfleet that they would require to have covered by that. In other words, how much money would it cost extra to have the 2 sites? So that they could see we were really serious. I don't really care about that. What I care about is 20 years from now, 10 years from now, for whatever reason, the alternatives aren't working, and suddenly we have to go back to the drawing board and have a real-life, applicable way to treat and to sewer, that this will not answer the needs further south.
So what we're trying to do right now is just minimize the cost of the alternative plan, because we could spend a lot more money on another site and evaluating it to DEP specifications right now. So let's just say we could spend, $100,000, another $200,000 evaluating a second site. We don't feel that really makes sense at this point, because we can use this as the site and it meets the requirements. If we actually get to the point where we have to put in a sewage treatment plant or multiple plants, that's a whole nother engineering process. And in 10 years or 15 years, if we're finding that our alternatives are not meeting the level of removal that we hoped and expected, we will be in an engineering process to begin to look at that. And it may, and ideally and hopefully, the plant size will have been reduced substantially, because we've at least made significant progress in the amount that we needed to remove. So now we're talking about having to build a smaller facility, and in fact it may be much more applicable at that point to only have to, for example, do the downtown area and not do the whole town. So, at this point, for planning purposes, I think it's really important to spend money on on projects and not on planning. So we could spend hundreds of thousands on that particular alternative addition to the plan, and how much removal will we have lost with the money that we could have used for actual programs?
I'd also like to add that I believe this site was chosen at a town meeting in 1982. I think that's, if history serves me right. And I'm just grateful that the powers that be had the foresight at that particular time to look at this northwest corner of the transfer station, for wastewater treatment. Because I don't even think we knew what the word was in 1982. But there's a record of this at town meeting, and the Board of Selectmen giving the thumbs up for this site, so.
Point of information to Kathleen, that was well before the USGS did that remarkable
Right.
study roughly 15 years ago, where it was clearly shown that all our groundwater travels slowly west. And if I was in the DP and I looked at that site, which has a lot of things going for it, I would look at the Herring River and say, it will go directly into the Herring River. So the real key thing is what form of treatment.
Right.
And that might be way ahead, way better in 20 years or 15 years. So that isn't going to be pinned down now, right?
Just a couple of additional comments. I think Kurt's answer was great. I agree, and I agree everything you said. If my mission was to come up with a plan to solve this problem with collection system, I would not be proposing one location at. I totally agree with you. It would make, given the geography of the town alone, it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so if you have to go there, which I don't believe you ever will, then you probably want multiple locations, given the geography of the town. But as Kurt said, you have an option. You can evaluate those now, and DEP would be happy to have a plan with 3 or 4 sites, as long as you do the hydrogeo on each site, etc. But they're not requiring it now.
It's gonna be expensive.
They're requiring one.
And we have to have.
The other comment I make is this is not, I want to be clear with, this plan, targeted watershed plan, once it's submitted, does not commit you to build a wastewater at this site. It simply allows you to move forward trying some other things. And as Kurt said, if 5 years later you realize, like, oh, maybe we should build treatment plants, you have every right to rethink the location. So I guess the question is, why spend the money now on other sites unless the town, what I'm hearing from the town is you probably don't want to build the wastewater plant up front, you want to try some alternatives first. If I get that right, then my suggestion would be, let's not spend a lot more money other than evaluating this site, which seems to be, all in all, the most likely one that DEP will sign off on. And I think, in addition to the geography, I think the Herring River impacts are really important to be evaluated, and may in fact show the site shouldn't be built there. But again, I think given what you've got in front of you and the history of the town's studies, this is the one that DEP will probably agree to most likely. Okay. Keep going? Yes.
I'm getting an overall feeling that, so our mission is to just really make the DEP happy. Isn't it to clean up the wastewater? I mean, the focus seems to be going, how can we get this done the cheapest way? And I just worry about preparation of the town. So preparation of the people who go to town meeting and who are going to approve this.
Good point.
People who are going to pay for it.
Yep.
You know, we need to start using our expertise, all of us, and whatever board we're on, to start telling people, this is what's happening, this is what the numbers that, we're getting are showing us. So that, we in the Board of Health, when we make regulations to people, we make sense, because that is part of our.
And clearly we gotta do both. I mean, clearly the town sees this as a crisis, and we have DEP requirements both.
I understand that, but they see it as a crisis, but if those
who
are making the decisions are saying it's not really a crisis, we're gonna get there.
No.
We'll never need a sewer system,
Scott Let,
You know.
Scott's got
Is there
some
a
things
good
here I
slide
think
in
that'll be
here?
pretty interesting.
Yeah, I was gonna ask John, actually, as far as the effect on, the potential effect on the Herring River project. If this is proposed, if it's in the background, it's not that we're gonna do this definitely, but will that change in any way going forward with the project? Is it gonna require any new remodeling? If the powers to be see that this may be in the future, you know, about their current modeling of the effect of opening the dike and all, is it gonna affect that at all? going
That
forward?
hasn't been analyzed, that would have to be looked at.
What?
When we know what the load is, when we know what the projected load is of nitrogen discharging into the Herring
Right.
River system, that would have to be analyzed. I couldn't
But it wouldn't
answer
delay,
that.
do you think, as far as, if they know this might happen, you can't, would
I
it
mean,
lead to any delay
I'm not sure
going
what the
forward?
process would be, but it would have to be looked at.
Well, the one thing that we have done, and when I say we, I want to include the Cape Cod Commission again here, is they did take a quick look at if you put all of this wastewater treated into this watershed. Now, a wastewater treatment plant will remove about 80% of the nitrogen. So you end up with a load, which would be 20% of the load that you transfer. One thing they did look at is it would be possible, there are enough septic systems in the Herring River watershed that if you included them as well and treated that, you might be able to achieve a net zero nitrogen impact.
As it flows through.
Sounds good.
Yeah, because you're removing some,
That's
but
simply
you're
a
adding.
calculation. So if the question is, will the additional nitrogen impact the Herring River in a negative way, it appears to be possible, just quick calculation, but adding in some additional homes within the watershed might be able to balance that. That needs to be looked at in a lot more detail, but that was a quick, because that's typically the way, that's the way Mass DEP looks at these, is they look at it net impacts on the watershed. So we don't know the answer yet.
So Scott, that additional flow would go into the flow stream and be
Yes.
treated, so you
Yes.
lose some of that nitrogen that was in those
Yes.
additional
Correct.
systems.
Correct.
Right.
Exactly.
That's right.
Diminish as
That's right.
the diminishing flow as
Yeah.
you're using it.
So that might be a mitigating
Right.
option. But we have-
Okay.
Okay, let me keep going.
In the ponds.
Right.
I do have 40 slides here, just, I'm free all afternoon. What's that?
Batteries work.
Okay.
So the pointer does work.
All right, so let's move into the alternatives. I'm gonna talk about, I think, 4 or 5 technologies that I think are the most, given feedback from the town, et cetera, most applicable. The first one I wanna talk about is so-called innovative and alternative septic systems. The acronym is INA systems, okay? And Mass DEP has a permitting process to approve these. And I know that you know about them because Hillary has, how many now in town?
Gosh, I don't know.
About 100 something?
Yeah, over
How many?
100,
We have 100?
over 100.
We have the highest, among the highest per capita implementation of IA systems of any town on the Cape.
Wow.
Yeah, according to George Hoyfelder.
Now, let me say that
George
there's
knows.
about,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna guess, I shouldn't guess, but I will. There's about 10 or 12 approved INA technologies now that remove nitrogen. The credit that DEP gives you is down to, I'm gonna throw out a number, 19 milligrams per liter. A standard Title V septic system, according to MEP, generates about 23 milligrams per liter. So you're going from 23 to 19, not a huge reduction. I'm not gonna talk about the systems today, because my sense is that's not a cost-effective way to get to the 10,000 kilograms reduction. There's a new generation, if I can use that term, of INA systems out there, and we are calling them enhanced INA, because they appear to do a lot better. Problem is, there's not many of them that really are permitted yet, but they're close. So I think given this, by the way, this is a 20-year plan at a minimum. Barnstable's been talking about a 60-year plan, but they've recently cut into 30 years. But 20 years at a minimum, so there's some time here. This is nothing that has to get built in 2021 or 2022. So the INA systems I want to talk to you about, I'm going to talk to you about 3 or 4 or 5 of them. The first one is something that, and many people have probably heard George Hoyfelder's name, who's Barnstable County Health Department, runs the Mass Tech Center over at MMR. He's been testing all of these alternative septic systems for quite a while. Honestly, is probably one of the best national research projects in the country now. There's 4 places in the country. I think George's operation might be the one that has produced the best data, so it's pretty good stuff. And what I want to talk to you about is some of the results of that I think applicable to Wellfleet. So the first one is the simplest one, and this is something that George developed based upon some work done in Florida. And that is to, when you build your leach field, put some wood chips. I'm gonna simplify this, okay? But essentially, to put some wood chips beneath the leaching field, because the wood chips provide a carbon source for the bacteria that are already there, and they help through their metabolic process break down the nitrogen into atmospheric nitrogen. And so this slide shows a septic system, a pump chamber, pressure dose system, and that horizontal rectangle is to represent a leach field, standard Title V leach field. Underneath it, in some type of shading, it says sawdust silt mix. What color is that? Is it gray?
Right.
Great.
Okay. So there's like a layer of sawdust mixed in with the sand. And he's been building these and testing them and getting around 80 to 90% removal of nitrogen. Instead of 19 milligrams per liter, he's getting around 6 milligrams per liter. Okay? So pretty simple. Looks like it works. It's still in the research phase. George is going to bring it through the process, but the process probably will be within our 20-year planning time frame, hopefully next 3 or 4 years.
The other thing I want to add about this particular approach is, so Laurel Schrader and their group have looked at these other things that people are concerned about in wastewater, contaminants of emerging concern. So that's pharmaceuticals and other chemicals that people are using, chemotherapy agents and all that sort of thing. The data on the removal from a septic system or this type of a system is significantly better for those type of compounds than it is in a sewage treatment plant. So a sewage treatment plant tends to concentrate them, whereas in this diffuse environment, they tend to get broken down. So right now, there is no technology to specifically address that, but their data was showing, Silent Spring Institute's data was showing that these are a little bit better than a sewage treatment plant. So there's some benefit there too.
So, this slide, is this the traditional INA or is this the enhanced?
Enhanced.
This is everything I'm talking about, I'm going to call enhanced, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
well,
Okay.
it's pretty simple
Yeah.
Pretty simple.
for enhanced, okay.
Let's skip over that slide.
Is it important to point out that it's not yet approved for
Yes.
general use? So it's still undergoing testing because the numbers in the winter weren't as good as the numbers for the rest of the year. So
Okay.
they still need to put in a certain number of systems to move it through the testing program to get it to general use.
And when are we looking at that, 2021 or?
Sometime in the next,
Few years,
Several
3 or
years.
4
Okay.
years.
Yeah.
There's Mass DEP's process for approving INA technologies. They have 3 steps called pilot, provisional, and general.
And once all of those have been,
And the number, you have to put in 15 systems under pilot, and then a total of 60, 65 to get through provisional. Once you get there and it all works, Mass DEP signs off on it, and then Hillary can start permitting these easily. But the interesting thing is, and we need to talk more about it, she can permit them now, just not easily. There is a process to put in these systems now, even though they're only provisional, but it requires a little more
and
permitting.
it's costly to the homeowner because they have to take the liability for the system. If it fails to work, then they have to go back and put in a different type of system,
well,
so.
it is the one I want, so yeah, that's what I would go with.
And also, one of, the 95 Lawrence Road project
Yeah,
would be an ideal candidate for a demonstration system.
yeah. Well, to talk just briefly about 95 Lawrence Road, what we're aware of with regard to water quality and the harbor studies is that nitrogen is loading from that elevation down through town into the harbor. Am I correct, John?
Mhm.
So,
The water table map, yep, checked out.
so, we are asking in the RFP
Yeah.
that the septic be absolutely state-of-the-art with regard to
Good.
nitrogen.
And we may
And
be
it's
able to
gonna
get,
be more costly?
well, we may
for
be
the
able to
developer,
get, we
but-
may be able to get grant funding to cover the difference.
Yes.
So it wouldn't be that
Yeah.
expensive.
Just wondering what the sort of cost
got a
difference is
slide
from
on
the
that.
traditional. Okay.
I got a slide on that. Okay, so this is the other thing, George has been looking at some alternative configurations of this. So the only difference with this one, you'll notice, sorry, I gotta get up again. Maybe I can point. Right here and here are leaching chambers,
Yeah.
okay? And this thing here, this doesn't seem to work. There it is. This dark line is a liner. So in this case, what he's done is put a liner down first and then the wood chips. The reason is that a lot of the data suggests that to get denitrification, which is getting rid of the nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, you need anaerobic, no oxygen conditions in the water. So by having a pool of water sitting there makes it go anaerobic, and it might be more efficient than just simply putting the wood chips in. So there's a few different configurations of the system that George has been researching with. Another one, just to skip ahead here, is, and this is more of a schematic, but you can see this is the leach, doesn't work. On the far right, the difference here is we're taking the wood chip bioreactor, as it says, or wood chip reactor, and instead of putting it underneath, we're putting it off to the side. Okay? So there's three, just to summarize, there's three options. One is just put some sawdust in underneath the leach field. Simple. The other one is put a liner in sawdust or wood chips. The third one is put that liner system off to the side rather than beneath, because one thing we ultimately have to talk about is these wood chips don't last forever. We don't know how long. 20, 30, 40, 50 years is a good range to think about. So at some point you need to replace them. That'll be easier to do if it's off to the side than if it's underneath. Okay, but it takes more area and space. So that's some of the thing to think about. Let me just move forward here. Here's the performance data on these systems. And the NY stands for New York because George is working with some people on Long Island who insisted they thought their sand was different than Cape Cod sand, so they actually shipped it up here and to put it into the test center, and it's not that different, no surprise to me, but they wanted to see New York sand versus Massachusetts sand. That's what so forget about the NYs here, but if you look at the other three, he's getting around 6 or 7 milligrams per liter effluent on these systems. 23 to 26 is the Title V, 19 is the existing INAs, and with his system he's getting 6 to 8, which is about a 75% reduction. So it's pretty significant. Costs. So real quick, this is a different option. Design 1 is the system with the liner. Design 2 is the system with no liner. Design 3 is the one with the wood chip reactor off to the right-hand side, okay? If you just look at the bottom line, and then way over on the right is a standard Title V system with and without a pump, because George is a big believer in dosed systems, so he kind of thinks all septic systems should have. There's other advantages to a dosed system. So standard Title V without dosing, according to his calculations, around $9,500. $1,600 with the dosing, and then $16,000, excuse me, and then when we come over to the left here, these systems are running around, let's just call it 20 grand. So simplest way to look at this is compared to a standard Title V system, about another $10,000 is the best way to generalize this, I think, in terms of a cost. Now, when we compare that to centralized sewering and treatment, the town of Barnstable is looking at sewering a bunch of areas, and their current cost is about $87,000 per household without O&M treatment going forward. So according to the Barnstable numbers, this is about 1/10 of the cost. It's the sewering. We don't have sewering numbers for Wellfleet that I know of, but they may be less than 87,000, but
Gonna be more because the density
they might be
is
more
less.
too.
Yeah.
The money that's coming in from short-term rentals that's putting into wastewater treatment that's been directed there, would that be potentially able to be used to offset?
Oh, yeah.
To
Potentially,
offset
yes.
the cost
Yeah.
for residents in order to implement these at a
So here's how I answer that question. The big advantage of doing a targeted watershed plan, getting the permit from DEP, is not just to make DEP happy, but it will also qualify you for State Revolving Fund, SRF loan money, which includes 0% financing and 25% forgiveness, meaning free, no payback. And it will allow you to utilize all these other sources of money like Airbnb. So once you get the permit, then the answer to your question is absolutely yes.
And to piggyback on that, Mike, one of the things that we could think about is from those monies, especially if we can use Airbnb money, you could theoretically give the homeowner the differential.
Yeah.
If it's costing us $10,000 per homeowner versus $90,000 if we were hooking up to a septic system, there's a good argument to be made, we should be subsidizing the difference.
What's the O&M, are there any O&M differences between traditional and alternatives?
Well, if you have a pump, for starters, you have a very small electric cost. I don't know what the number is, but it's dollars per month probably thing. And then you do have the longer-term replacement of the wood chips. And again, we don't know the answer to that yet, but I'll give you the estimate from reports I've read, 20 to 40 years, once every 20 to 40 years.
There's also operation and maintenance costs associated with any IA system.
right,
So that
monitoring,
runs
yes,
about
yep.
$1,200 a year
Okay, so
as an
that's still
estimate in
manageable.
today's dollars.
Still
For
manageable.
typical
And that's
IAs.
$1,200 per the average homeowner?
Yes,
Yeah, but that's for a typical IA.
that's
Needs
for,
to be
yeah,
less.
a typical IA.
Yeah. John?
Yeah, I don't want to get ahead of us, but it does seem to me we should think in terms, not just of the whole town and then individuals, but think about the possibility, there's some areas of the town that are just not going to be appropriate to put in unless George's system or equivalent to George's system. I mean, the IA system, let's take that off the table, they're just not that good. What we have to be careful we don't do is take the money that becomes available to the town, say in the Airbnb money, and then give it to people to put in the enhanced systems. And then it turns out that we haven't met our target for the downtown immediate harbor, and then we do have to put in a septic system for that area, and there's no money for it. I think we have to be very careful.
Of course,
We don't
yeah.
close off future options. In the short term, great, but we don't want to act in the short term that's going to cost us more money. On top of that, what are the people who are going to think who are in the downtown, and I don't mean just the Main Street, but in the harbor area, who've invested the extra $10,000 on the alternative system, and then 10 years down the line, we say, too bad, you've got to hook up into our sewer system, and we're going to charge you, the town's going to tax you to pay for that because we squandered all the money we got from
Yeah,
Airbnb.
it's a great-
And
yeah.
two, those people are not going to be happy campers. I wouldn't be. So
Yeah,
I think we have to plan.
yeah, it's a great point,
in terms
John.
of the different parts of the town,
It's a
as well
great-
as the whole town.
Yeah, it's a great point, but I think part of this process is specifically to prioritize by watershed what needs to be done. So in other words, my comment was only to say, is to give an example, that there's an argument to be made that the town can subsidize certain activities based on the fact that installing a sewer system would be substantially more money. Not that we would or, yeah, not that we would or could.
If I may, John, Justine Crossan, I sit on the committee that is beginning to look at, it's all towns, it's beginning to look at the collection disbursement of Airbnb. It's early days, so I think we're getting into the weeds of possible policies that haven't even been thought about.
With respect to systems, there actually are systems now that don't even go into the ground. You put them in your garage, you put them in a shed. There's a company on Long Island that's doing this now, and you may have even seen it on This Old House. But there are these it's like it looks like a laundromat in your garage or something, and they'll actually drink the water at the end of it. It's one of these systems, so that may be in the future. It's way beyond pilot stage. It's actually being used now. I think it's called Bossy is the company on Long Island. And I think the future is going to be, we're not even going in the ground with the stuff, which would be, obviously out here, amazing improvement, as far as everything will be done above ground in these systems. They say they can put it in a shed in your backyard or whatever. I mean, there are these innovative technologies that are way beyond using ground filtration, hope that, enough bacteria, all that kind of stuff. So that may be in the future too. I think it's going to, I don't know the cost of it though.
So
It's ready to go until 2 o'clock. I'm fine with
Yeah.
that. I'm fine with that, but you tell me.
somebody has,
Try to get-
nobody has mentioned the other reason to have on-location IAs or enhanced IAs, or what Nick, member of the Board of Health, is describing. One of the things about this part of the Cape is ideally you have water taken out of the ground and the 70% returned. You don't do these massive removals of water from one part of what's under us and send it somewhere else. Because we've got something quite fragile here in terms of our various lenses of water. It isn't just one big aquifer.
Right. Let me just try to be a little bit more expedient. I think Scott's got some really interesting stuff that I think you'll all really appreciate. I think it's been great, and I'm hoping we have more of these type of meetings, and of course, outside these meetings, have a lot more of these type of conversations, and just with the interest of time, just want to try to keep moving a little bit better through the slides.
Okay, and I'm competing with lunch
We have a
too,
half an
right?
hour. We have a half an hour. We have a scheduled half an hour left, but
I know who will lose that one. All right, now the other thing I want to mention is there are two technologies that are out there, commercial technologies, that are also achieving similar nitrogen levels, and those are available as well. The first one is the so-called nitro system developed by an individual out in Martha's Vineyard. He is in the piloting process. He has a system at George's test center. George likes this system. You can see what he's doing is putting the wood chips in a chamber as opposed to in the ground, which makes them a lot easier to change out in the future. There's a lot more to the system, but I'm not going to go through it in the interest of time, but it is working. The other one is something called Nitrix, and interestingly, it is the only one of everything we're talking about that has been approved for provisional level, and this is definitely available because we put one in Eastham a couple of years ago. There's actually two of these systems on the Cape, one in Mashpee and one in Eastham, and he's getting, as it says there, 2 to 3 milligrams per liter, at least during this part of the study. So this is another technology, Nitrix, that is available.
Which is a 90% reduction.
Yeah, 90% reduction. So there's a couple of commercial technologies in addition to George's. George knows all about these, and I think, agrees that they're good systems, blah, blah, blah. So those are available as well. Now, this is probably, I think, the most interesting slide in all this stuff. Hillary hasn't seen this yet, but it's numbers Hillary gave to me. So these are the numbers of so-called repairs and upgrades for the last 3 years that she gave me. I totaled them up, 66, 62, and 69. That averages out to around 66, and if I multiply that times 20 years, our planning period, that means she's going to be approving or about 1,300 of these systems in the next 20 years. If I look at if we started today with the next INA or next system repair requiring one of these enhanced INAs, that would give you a 75% reduction. And I calculate that out on the right-hand side there over the next 20 years, that's 4,600 kilograms of nitrogen reduced. That's about half of what you need to reduce town-wide under existing load. So that's pretty significant. So this is something to think about, that a town health regulation that requires an upgrade starting like tomorrow, and you just play that over 20 years, don't build anything new, you're solving half your problem. So that's an interesting option to think about, and arguably probably the cheapest thing you can do, because most of these people are going to be spending money anyways to do something to their septic system. That's the time to get in there and do the right thing. Okay, so that's what this calculation is. I haven't had a chance to talk to you about this with Hillary, so we need to do that and figure out. I'm sure there's some other parts of the discussion, but let me keep going because we want to get this stuff out there. In fact, I'm going to skip over these and talk about the second technology, which I think has some good application here, something called a permeable reaction barrier, or a PRB. What we're potentially doing here, as this slide suggests, is digging a trench in the ground and intercepting the groundwater that has a lot of nutrients in it before it gets to the embayment. There's been a lot of these built around the country for various purposes, and they work really well. In fact, the best guess on these are 90% plus removal of nitrogen. Typically, you're filling that trench with wood chips again, or some wood-based product. There are three of these that have been built on Cape Cod. Actually, two of these in Falmouth at Wacoit Bay. If you're interested, they have in fact, did I put that in here? No. There is there's a lot of good information on that you can look at on their website, the Wacoit Bay Estuary Project. That's been there for about 15 years, and they've been getting around 90% removal of nitrogen on a shallow trench system. Now, as this slide also suggests, you can only go so deep with a trench based upon technology to dig it. The deepest, using the best equipment, is about 40 feet. And the groundwater system on this part of the Cape, along the shoreline, I'm going to guess in many places is probably on the order of 60, 80, or 100 feet thick. So there's going to be some groundwater that's going to go underneath the system you're not going to be able to catch with this technology. So there is a close cousin here. Instead of digging the trench, you put a series of wells. If you can picture this, almost every 10 feet or 20 feet along the shoreline. And instead of wood chips, you inject an emulsified vegetable oil. And similar effect, you're providing a carbon source for the bacteria. You can go to any depth now. And they've installed one of these in Orleans, and they've been monitoring it. And again, it's working quite well. So we've got a good case study nearby. Here's the picture from LaQuoit Bay. I'm colorblind, but people tell me you can see two different colors along that shoreline, some red and some green. The green is algae, and the other part where it says no algae is directly downstream from where they put the PRB in. So in the case of LaQuoit, not only were they able to show 90% nitrogen removal, they showed that the algae disappeared along the beach, nitrogen causing the algal bloom. This is a close-up of the Duck Creek subwatershed and the Duck Creek embayment right in the middle there. And each one of these dots, by the way, represents a septic system. This is Cape Cod Commission data as well. And a projected nitrogen load from it based upon water use. Now, in the case of Wellfleet, we don't have a lot of water records, but at least projected water use. Question.
Does this include cesspools?
Yes,
When you say
the amount of
septic
water,
systems,
yeah, and nitrogen probably doesn't vary a lot between a cesspool and a septic system, so this would include either. Now, the place that I'm looking at as a pilot to consider is right along here, this is Commercial Street, because the groundwater's coming this direction, there's a lot of nitrogen according to this model right there. So it looks like you could put a PRB pilot, test it along there, and it might be an option to do that. There's a close-up of it, again, the intersection of Bank Street and Commercial. And there's a photo of that little parking lot where the town, in conjunction with NRCS, not too long ago, put in a stormwater remediation project. I'm in the process of trying to get these plans to see exactly what was built there, but it might be possible to put something in there as a test facility and as a pilot. And these things look like they're pretty cost-effective alternatives. So that's PRB.
Back up just one
All right.
second, Scott. One of the, to the other one, one more. So the other thing is that if you can imagine, for example, if you look at, you see Cannon Hill Park in the middle there, but if you imagine a PRB system that basically went from about the mobile station or from basically about where Route 6 intersects Main Street, and you came all the way around down Commercial and all the way around down to the pier and all the way around to about Keller's Corner, Kendrick Ave, where 90's away. If you look at the amount of nitrogen that would be intercepted by a PRB system in that area, it's pretty substantial.
Yeah,
It's unbelievable.
Really good
So, to be able to do, if we were able to do a pilot and show the type of results that we're seeing elsewhere, there's a huge opportunity to remove directly a lot of nitrogen that's flowing very quickly into the harbor from those systems.
That's another good point. The advantage of this compared to the INAs is time.
Yeah.
The INAs, a lot of places you have a 10, 20-year flow time between the septic systems and the receiving water. If you put the PRB 100 feet, 200 feet from the Duck Creek, that's about a year or less flow time. So you're going to see water quality benefits quicker.
Are we suggesting that homeowners do this, or this is a town project, or?
This would be a town project.
And
Town
what will be
project,
the-
possibly with grant money. There are grants available for some of this, but I think as we get to, I think the process is get a plan, get DEP to permit it, and then once it gets permitted, the clock starts running, and the state, are going to want to see steps, and one of the first steps could be these small-scale pilot projects. Not a lot of money. Put some of these enhanced IAs in, put a small PRB, maybe 100 feet, ultimately, as Kurt's saying, you might wanna go 2 miles and cover the whole harbor, or a mile, I don't know how long it is. But you might start with 100 feet and test it, and that would be a good first step.
Now, these PRVs, is it a wood chip design
No, in
too, or is
Orleans,
it
they're using the
bacteria?
injected emulsified oils. In
Okay.
Detroit, they use the wood chips.
Okay.
Do you know if that has any impact whatsoever on pathogens?
Pathogens?
Pathogens,
I
in wastewater,
don't-
because at Stuck Creek, I was always wondering about what happens
I haven't
there.
seen any data on pathogens, no.
Okay.
It's just carbon source, so.
No, I understand, I was just curious.
I mean, it seems to me Duck Creek is a nice target area, but it also seems to me we have to keep in mind that we've got sea level rise, so there's limits to
Yes.
where we can move this without running into problems
Yes.
as the water rises.
Yep. Okay, stormwater. This photo's not from Wellfleet. There are some, as all the Cape Towns, there are a lot of direct stormwater discharges. Route 6 is a good one here. That's a nitrogen source. I didn't mention this, but according to the MEP report, about 80% of your land-based nitrogen comes from septic systems, 10% lawn fertilizers, and 10% stormwater. So stormwater is a source, and there are other benefits to correcting these stormwater impacts, notably pathogens and shellfish closures is a big one, and metals and hydrocarbons and everything else. So there are some places that were identified as part of 208 where we might undertake some stormwater mitigation projects, much like the one that was done at Bank Street and Commercial. So more of that type of thing could be part of your plan. This is just a quick picture of one that was built in the town of Barnstable for the purpose of removing nitrogen. This is a stormwater remediation project, a linear trench basically planted, which now intercepts the stormwater going into, this is in Cotuit Bay in the town of Barnstable. So just an example of a pilot project that could be built. There's the stormwater going in with not only nitrogen, but a lot of oils, hydrocarbons, that otherwise go directly into the bay. Shellfish are great at bioaccumulating the hydrocarbons and metals. We don't normally test for that stuff, but they're really good at bioaccumulating that stuff. And then, of course, oysters and shellfish I put in here because it's always been part of the town plan. I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about this because you guys have already done that. But there are obviously direct benefits to harvesting these animals and pulling the nitrogen out of the water. There's also pretty good scientific indication that there's other benefits of nitrogen removal from nitrification, denitrification in the sediments underneath these, especially like oyster reefs and whatnot. This is some data that Ryan Curley put together, and I think, Nancy, he used your data in terms of landings. I'm not sure the same data you sent me. But one of the questions is, what's happened since the MEP study around 2005 to current in terms of landings? Now, I haven't reviewed this data. Ryan put this together. He's been putting a lot of good time in on trying to help out. He's not here today, but he has been presenting some of this. So if this is true, and Nancy, you probably have the best guess at looking at the levels, it looks like it's been overall not changed a lot since 2004 in terms of the overall landings. Would you agree with that as a?
No.
No, okay.
Because we've shown an increase in, I think, farmed oyster landings since 2012.
Okay. So
but the thing is that, so the source is Mass DMF SAFIS dealer records, which
Yeah.
they compiled from
Yeah.
2005 to 2018. But then what he did is do the nitrogen of the
Yes,
landing.
yes.
So we got the landings from the state,
Correct.
and I don't know the
Right.
way that the nitrogen is calculated.
So what we can do is take your data and do sort of an update on this and look at what's happened from 2004, 2005. The reason I want to do that is because if it has increased, we can get that as a credit right now. You've already
But
done
this is that
something.
information.
What's
That's
that?
the information that we requested. This is new. We
Okay.
just got this.
Yes.
But I just remember, reading the emails from the state where they said that there's been increased
Yeah.
oyster aquaculture since 2012.
Okay. And then, of course, the other part of this, this is the map I put in that Kurt sent me, just obviously some of the grants out there, there's a lot of them. One thing the town needs to think about, and I know you've already been thinking about, is this this is a permittable nitrogen reduction technique that DEP will give you credit for. So if you can show in your plan that you're gonna increase landings, either through additional grants or town projects or whatever, you can get a credit for that. So something that, and has to come from the town, I know there's been a lot of discussion around this. I'm not gonna in any way, shape, or form suggest or tell you what the number should be. That's completely up to the town. But it's something to think about as part of this plan. How do we and who, most importantly, decides what, if anything, maybe you punt on this and say, we don't want it in the plan, that's okay too. But if you do, we need to show some plan of extra increase in shellfish. So that's something to think about, how you would do that and how you're gonna get some consensus on that, because I'm absolutely sure you're gonna have differing opinions on that. Yes?
Yes.
Just a quick question. The credit system on how that works. So it's based on the year that they
This is it right here. Let me go through this first.
Yeah, I was asking the question right before
As
you
long as your
answer
questions
it.
I'm covering, so.
But let me just make sure
Go
I
ahead.
get the question out there real quick. So it's based on the year that they did the analysis of our nitrogen load.
Yes.
So that any increase would already be credited.
Could be.
Could be credited if it's been a dramatic increase since that time
Sure.
in landed
Sure.
shellfish.
Yeah, yes.
In order to maintain the stability of the environment in the harbor for our shell fishery, we should absolutely not increase our production and harvesting simply for this. What's cool about Wellfleet is we have way more going on with this already.
Yes.
Other places put in
Yes.
the reefs.
Yeah.
So that has to be considered because the economic viability of the fishery depends on another kind of balance. And we want people farming productively and profitably, which they are already doing.
Yep.
Yeah. It shouldn't happen just to address the nitrogen, given how much of it
Yes.
we already have.
Agreed. So
No,
this,
but I'll just give you one example though. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what Helen said. Because I'm on two committees that have all of the other towns, I think Helen's point is important, and Wellfleet is kind of a beacon. But 25% of our year-round population derives income from oysters. And I think that in a challenging economy for year-round people, and that's why we invest in affordable housing, I think Helen's point about maintaining the viability of the shellfish industry is important. And we are in a leadership position on that point.
Yeah, so in terms of in terms of how this could fit, the only thing the DEP is going to look at is either landings, for example, from the commercial industry. So an increase in landings would get you additional credit. And the only other thing that would give you credit would be things like some sort of standing oyster reef. And for example, the pier area is an area that DMF has recently, Nancy said we is kind of off limits because of the number of vessels in certain areas of the pier area.
It's the only place that's
So-
closed is actually where there are vessels, so you wouldn't be able to do a reef there because there's boats there.
Well, we could do more, for example, on the rock,
Yeah,
on
so
the
the rocks
area,
in
in
the
the
area,
area,
on the
in that
north side.
area.
Yep.
So that's just a small example. The other benefits to thinking about, areas that are currently have either a small or little to no population, that we enhance the population and keep the population there. That would provide additional filtration benefits. And ultimately, the goal of this whole plan is to get ecosystem services returned to the harbor. And, one of the things that's missing right now in the harbor is normal transects of, say, for example, salt marsh and, oysters and eelgrass, the things that used to be out in the harbor. And that's affecting our fish productivity rates, our fin fish productivity rates, and it also is reducing and affecting our scallop production rates. So there are a number of things that we need to think about in terms of how ecosystem services need to get returned to the harbor, in addition to water quality. But that oyster connection does have a, an impact on overall how this harbor is going to look. And one of the things that we're seeing from black mayo accumulation, and specifically, as John alluded to right at the outset of the meeting, if in fact the majority of our black mayo is coming from non-man-made sources, that's basically a problem of filtration, which means restoring our filter feeders, and that doesn't mean just oysters. That's mussels, oysters, quahogs, herring, other filter feeder fish. It's big, it's bigger than just oysters. But I think it's important to at least be thinking about what we can and should be doing in that regard to ultimately restore real water quality health in the harbor. It's, we can do all we want with permeable reactive barriers and stop nitrogen that's getting into the harbor, but that's also by itself not going to fix our problem.
Quick point, I think that seed and what's growing out on all the various areas should also be submitted to the DEP, because all those animals are also filtering nitrogen.
Yep.
And you can document the seed in terms of people's purchases. And the Shellfish Department has some sense of what's being donated and caught on Chinese heads. You could ballpark it conservatively, and I feel that that should also be submitted to the DEP, because it's ongoing, it's happening now. And, it's in some ways perhaps, for a variety of reasons, more accurate than the actual DMF figures for the other end.
And I think that, I think Barnstable County did a study, they did a study about the potential removal of nitrogen by I think it was oysters only, I don't think they did clams. It wasn't extremely encouraging, but it did show, to the best of my recollection, that smaller shellfish actually remove more.
Well, let me
So,
just, before,
just
there's a
to-
lot of questions, but let me just tell you what's in the slide.
Yeah.
When I put it here, and then you guys can, because it gets to what you're talking about, Nancy. This slide was prepared for the Cape Cod Commission Technology Matrix, which is the document that DEP uses to provide credits to towns. So this is kind of the official source, if you will. And this slide, this analysis was prepared by that Barnstable County study that you're referring to, Nancy. Josh Reisma was a key preparer of this slide.
Oh,
It was
great.
ultimately adopted by the Cape Cod Commission and now is used by Mass DEP. So this is what will give you credits when we go. And the important thing is look at the categories, and it gets to the little guys, the nursery culture. You're right. Look at the numbers on the far right. Those are in uptake, in kilograms per acre per year. So the biggest number on this chart is 350 kilograms per year for year one, oyster nursery. Now it's driven by density. If you look somewhere in here is density, was 3 million. Yeah, the far, next to the right, 2,700,000 individuals per acre. That's high density according to Josh. And obviously there's a range there. So the point I want to make in this, and again, we can talk about this as long as you'd like today, is that what I need, I'm helping you put the plan together, and one of the things I really, really, really need from the town is somebody, some group of people to tell me how much of each of these categories we've had since 2004, and then probably more importantly, what's the future plan? My sense is the most difficult part of this is not the science, it's the process of getting people to talk and develop some consensus. And I would urge, and I don't know who it is, whether it's the Board of Selectmen, Nancy, Kurt, Hillary, somebody's got to think about and decide who is on that group and how many meetings, 2, 100, I don't know, to come up with a plan. I need to, or we just don't put it in here, but that's a tough one. And of everything I've talked about, I think I can do most of it, but this one I can't do. I can only put in here what you tell me. And the important question I have is, who is you? I have no idea.
So just so that point, isn't the quantifiable factor of landed oysters, because it's the easiest thing to quantify, right?
Yep.
But the amount of nitrogen reduced is its lifespan, not just that year that you harvest it.
Right.
So, to me, adding all the seed numbers, I mean, it kind of makes sense to some point, to some degree. Of course, there's seed that dies along the way, but it seems to me like you could factor pretty much every legal oyster in this harbor gets harvested at some point within its, 3 to 4 year. And petites, but they count also, but the number is quantifiable by its harvest, based on its entire lifespan of being a seed to grow out in some way. I don't know how accurate that number is, but, counting seed doesn't seem to make sense, because in the end, there's not many oysters left in this harbor that aren't harvested by the end of their lifespan. That, some die, whatever. We're probably maybe reducing more than we might get credit for.
Right.
But the thing I think that matters is that, the growth in the industry, obviously farmers aren't going to grow oysters if they're not getting a reasonable price for them. So you don't want people reducing the amount. It's going to counterbalance itself, right, due to market conditions. So if the market is calling for the production of more oysters or more clams right now, really, there's definitely a need for clams in the harbor. There's not enough. The price is really high. And those kind of things kind of go up and down, and that's why I don't necessarily think it's prudent to create a plan for growth that's targeted like that, but rather sort of try and figure out a way that we can get credit as things go. I think naturally, with the amount of people in the harbor, we're not talking about one farm, we're talking about 140 farmers. They're going to be reacting to how things are and growing different species as things sort of develop, and disease could literally wipe out an entire harbor's worth of oysters in a matter of months. So those kind of things I think need to be considered, and we should really just be looking at, how can we really quantify the number of nitrogen removed sort of based on general mortality and the amount of oysters that are harvested every year, because they really do represent currently, what's in the harbor. That's how I feel about it.
Yep, I want to just add one thing there, though. One of the things, so an oyster harvested gives you a certain amount.
It's just quantifiable.
Yeah, it's quantifiable, and I think you're absolutely right, Mike, that's, in terms of looking at the numbers, it's easier to do that, and Josh has numbers for, he's got petites and he's got, 3-inch oysters, so we can look at that. But the one thing that's also true is, again, I'll go back to the idea that we don't have enough filtration in the harbor right now. So our historic levels of filtering organisms is historically low. Black Mayo problem is one of lack of filtration. If we're gonna make significant headway on one of the largest problems or one of the largest threats to the industry itself, we've got to be thinking about that as well. And that may mean that we want more reserve oyster, meaning, and I like the term reef because that doesn't pose a threat to the industry. There's social issues in terms of how you actually do that, how you monitor it, police it, where, etc. But it's, bringing up the herring population is another way to be increasing filtration. Increasing our amount of eelgrass by, for example, cutting off dragging in certain areas to allow the restoration of eelgrass could be helpful. But this piece of the puzzle is something that's very difficult for us to deal with, but I think is going to be very important in terms of the overall longevity and of the industry itself. I mean, it's kind of like dredging is also another really big factor here. Getting the stuff out of here and having a maintenance dredge plan. So there's a variety of elements of this that, I think are really designed to ultimately improve the productivity of the industry, and the industry needs to be a participant in some of this stuff. And some of it's maybe a little threatening at the outset, but we've got to kind of try to figure out how to work through it.
Just to that point real quickly, the idea of reefs, I don't think anybody's opposed to having some non-harvested reefs, but, you know, at the time when the harbor was productive with the amount of oysters that you're referring to, we didn't have dermo. It wasn't even a thing. You're talking about a situation where an adult oyster lives 3 to 5 years with derma. It's all over the place in the harbor. So the idea of like going back to a situation where we have like massive reefs that live 8, 9 years without the sort of potential for a massive die-off where high counts of dermo can be released into the water column. I mean, those days are over as far as I'm concerned. You have just too much mortality due to disease and the potential for disease to spread. So I just don't see that as a viable solution to reducing large amounts of nitrogen to have animals that are unharvested in giant concentrations.
Yeah, and I don't want to defer, I don't want to, take a digression here because, we're getting into some detail there that we want to talk about probably in additional meetings.
Yeah, sure.
To continue that discussion.
Yeah, I was gonna agree with, that we need to move on, but I do think there's an incredible amount of practical science in the shellfish community, and we should make sure that the science goes through the Shellfish Advisory. It takes a lot of science to make a living growing oysters, and there's all kinds of scientists in the world. Some go to school for science, and some work with their hands and observe the natural world. So, given the impact on the sensitivity and impact on, we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot in terms of our job base in order to get a clean harbor. I think this.
We need
There
to
should
find
be
a win-win.
a number of
yeah.
meetings with the shellfish warden and Shellfish Advisory to vet the science and getting cross-pollination of ideas.
We have 2 salt marsh restoration
Coming up.
projects in progress.
3 more slides.
I'm wondering how that could contribute to.
Coming up.
Why don't I finish up the last 3 slides? We have to finish before 12:30, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Ecosystem restoration. So the other thing on the list for sure here is a variety of projects, including Harry River, Mayo Creek. And then on the far right, again, Ryan has put together a compendium of other potential projects in the town, which we talked about at the last wastewater committee meeting. So all of these, I think, can and probably should play a role. The challenge with this technology, if I can use that term, is there is no good, easy, predictive method of nitrogen reduction. So this goes in the plan as more of a narrative. The town's going to do these things, or hopes to do these things, and we think they will reduce nitrogen, and we will measure it, and we'll get back to you with monitoring data, as opposed to saying so many kilograms per nitrogen. So that's part of I think that should be, in my opinion, can be part of the plan, but it's going to be challenging to put a number on it. And this is my last slide. And I think this helps capture how at least we might pull all this together. To get a watershed permit, what Mass DEP is going to require is down the bottom, have traditional technology, identify a treatment plant, etc. And you'll notice that this is over a 20-year period with 4 5-year periods. So the idea is we identify a backup wastewater plan, and then up at the top we try a number of these so-called non-traditional technologies. Now we talked about, I think, 4 or 5 of them today. This slide shows 3, but it could easily be 5. So what happens is over the first 5 years we build pilot projects on each of the technologies. We test them, see if the town thinks they're working, see if DEP thinks they're working, and then as the green dots suggest, if it's good, we do more. If the first 100-foot strip of PRB works, then we build the next 1,000 feet and keep going, etc. If some things don't work, we abandon them. We don't do any more. And the middle color, I guess it's yellow, suggests maybe there are things that work okay, maybe we can tweak them and make them work better. And the idea is every 5 years, this is exactly how the Pleasant Bay watershed permit works, which is, by the way, is the first permit in the state that we're modeling this plan after. Every 5 years is a check-in between the state and the town. How are we doing? And along with this, by the way, is water quality monitoring, obviously out in the bay, to see if things are getting better or worse. And every 5 years, you revisit the plan, a so-called adaptive management, and make some alterations. At some point, if none of the stuff up top is working that well, it's not just not working at all, then DEP is gonna push for moving the sewer plan ahead. The next step would be a design, and that would be the point you might say, well, we wanna look at some alternative sites and some different technologies. And then maybe build the first phase of that 10 years out or something like that, if nothing up the top is working. So that's kind of the framework that's suggested, and that's what we ultimately would put in the plan. But we need to figure out what those technologies are and how many of them, which is the process we're going through. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.